The conversation has been going around a bit lately about what makes a good game and what elevates a game to the level of art. This discussion won't be really focused on such concerns, but it is a good time to mention that for much of the history of gaming, what made a game good was its gameplay, as story was something early games simply didn't have the memory for. The dawn of the NES and its cartridges did see some RPGs and story-heavier games start to pop up, but in that era gameplay was still pretty much the king in determining which games became popular. The Gradius franchise spans several games of several names, many of which don't include the word Gradius in the title, but all of which deal with the planet where your Vic Viper spatio-temporal fighter is from, Planet Gradius, the lead planet in the Metallian system. The game series finds its origin in games like Twin Bee and Zevious, scrolling shooters where you control a ship that can move around the screen and shoot at waves of oncoming enemies while avoiding them and their projectiles. There are several spin-off and parallel franchises to the main Gradius line which use the same elements in both gameplay and in story, and together these games form their own kind of franchise of franchises, or really kind of a multiverse to put it more simply. Specifically, the Gradius universe started with that series, in addition to the Salamander, Nemesis, and Life Force games, all of which take place in the same canonical universe. Later, Konami would come back and add on to this universe with the release of Otomedius, firmly rooting the multiverse element as canon with the shadowy multidimensional organization known only as G. Sorting out what makes up the canon of these games is not an easy task, as not a whole lot of info from official sources exists. The development process for these games back in the mid to late 80s was a kind of creation by committee, where Konami would sort of get an idea for a specific target audience and an objective for what they wanted to make their next game do, and the games were kind of built from that level up. Gradius started as a game intended to be marketed more towards women, according to some of the documents Konami's marketing provided in the release of the Classics collection, which includes Twin Bee, Salamander, and the other Konami scrolling shooters. Despite these games being built from a more conceptual level, they did get their own stories, and together they represent a fairly healthily fleshed out storytelling universe. And with the addition of a trio of animated hour-long shows about the events of the Salamander and Gradius games, there's actually quite a lot that can be said about how this game's franchise's universes operate. If you're interested in getting an idea of what happens in chronological order in this story, I won't be really spending much time going over that in this video, so you might want to either pause now or make a note to later go back and look up the Gradius fandom wiki, as that's the best single source I found in my research for listing out the entire chronology on one page. The whole story is a little messy, as some games, for example Life Force, were simply reskins and slight updates of the Japanese MSX or arcade versions of the original releases of these games so that they could be ported to English or other language-speaking audiences. Life Force itself is just a reskin of Salamander with some extra levels and the ship upgrade system swapped over to Gradius' style, as Salamander had used an earlier rooted direct power-up pickup system instead of the power-up selector bar that Gradius introduced. Despite all this, Life Force's events are canon and are indeed also considered separate events, taking place shortly after Salamander's story as a kind of echo where the good guys have to fight off essentially the same invasion all over again. So, with all that said, who are these cosmic bad guys that keep coming at the Gradians, yet keep getting wrecked by a single ship named after a snake sent on a nearly suicidal solo infiltration mission? The Bacterian Empire is made up of Bacterian, a race of hive-minded mimics that exist as a kind of bacteria-sized gas or mist, capable of taking on a crystalline structure and thus are able to form into nearly any larger object, inorganic or organic. And all this morphic matter is controlled by a single hive-minded entity, named Bacterian, who sends out parts of himself to enact invasions and spread throughout the galaxy. In the OVA, the Bacterian are shown arriving in the form of an infested planetoid surrounded by this black gas. Once in orbit, the planetoid begins to use this gas to alter the environment of the planet to whatever is optimal for its own reproduction, and so the surface of the entire planet will turn into organic masses, giant muscle sheaths, and flailing intestine-like tubes pulsing and throbbing all along the surface as the planet's inhabitants and entire mass are slowly consumed and destroyed. The process by which the Bacterian invade and multiply their forces is much like how a bacteria invades a host body and thrives, by infesting healthy cells and basically turning them into bacteria factories, but on a planetary scale. As such, much of the Bacterian's own defenses are focused on repelling large-scale efforts to destroy them, such as large fighter formations and bigger cruiser-class ships. This is the core of why the Vic Viper and other single-man fighters in this series have such a stellar track record against Bacterian. It's a mismatch every single time. It's straight out of the Death Star trench run in Star Wars. When the Bacterian attack the Gradians, their leader, Bacterian, isn't necessarily part of each individual effort. Specifically, the Bacterian will typically capture a human and make them a host through a conversion process, extracting their brains into a kind of cyber brain mechanism, whereby that host brain is then turned to the task of forcibly overseeing the invasion locally, acting as a kind of central nervous system to the rest of the Bacterian force's peripheral nervous system. Horrifically, the host brain seems to retain its original host's consciousness, as in the OVA the host is shown communicating telepathically to another character to help them defeat the Bacterian invasion, essentially begging them to kill him. This cyber brain core is also known in the games as Zeros or Zelos, and is the final boss of some of the Gradius games, and it features a vaguely human-sounding death knell. In one game, it is shown as the core of a giant mechanical base as the final boss, and it's simply suspended there and you just have to destroy its supports. But in another game, it's in the same position at the end of this big mechanical fortress, but with the addition of a salamander enemy flying around it as an added protector that you have to destroy first. In Gradius 5, you even get to destroy many of these Zelos cores in the early level of that game. Typically, a Zelos core constitutes the highest level of order in the Bacterian's hive mind and houses the intelligent force, but in 5's case, there's a level of order above the Zelos cores, a brain in a special ship that calls itself Venom that itself houses the invader's intelligence, reducing the Zelos cores in that game to the standard enemy type they occupy. More on all that later, though. Many times in the franchise's canon, the final boss will be destroyed in the form of this Zelos core or a cyber brain, but it won't be completely vaporized, and thus a chunk of genetic material will often float through space until it takes root on some other planet. Like a plant, that seed can then regenerate the entirety of the invasion it was broken off from, and this is how in several of these games we play seemingly the same events from a past game again, but with a reskin or maybe an extra level or two, as if maybe the second generation of the original invasion had some different makeup to the soil it grew in, and thus it bloomed in a different color. One last note before moving on past who and what the Bacterian are, I have to bring up the Moai statues. These statues are present throughout the Gradius games as enemies, and indeed are forces of the Bacterian, just yet another structure formed from their crystalline base. But remember, these are just mimics of some other life form that the Bacterian has encountered internalized in the past. In the OVA, it's shown that these Moai statues existed on another planet in the Metallion system named Lattice. One of the two statues in the show floated out in space in a constant, non-degrading orbit around the planet and served as a kind of lighthouse for nearby spaceships, as the signals coming from the Moai statue contained information about other nearby ships and was very useful for navigation. When a second statue is found on the planet during excavation to build a temple, the arrogant ruler prince, Lord British, orders the statue moved. It's not exactly clear how, but as the statue is being lifted by a crane out of this excavation, the statue somehow increases in weight, as if, say, some magnetic force was engaged, and it pulls itself back down to the ground, bringing the crane down, crashing on top of it, and destroying the whole mess. Immediately following this, the twin statue in orbit splits itself in half, and one half flies off into space, crashing through a ship on the way out, causing the first wreck in space for that system's history. These events, it turned out, were foretold in that planet's history, and immediately following this, the Salamander invasion begins. In another episode, happening before the Salamander invasion of Lattice, back on Gradius, another Moai statue is shown there as being kind of repellent to the Bacterian, and the Bacterian have to resort to disguising one of their own as a human and manipulating a Gradian into destroying the Moai statue for them before they can continue with the full invasion of the planet. Somehow this Moai statue has the power to repel the Bacterian, but later versions of this Moai statue are themselves made by the Bacterian, and thus they don't have the same function, or likely even the same internal structure as these shown in the OVA. It should be noted, though, that the source of these originals' power is described as a psychic force that repels the Bacterian. At the core of the OVA's story is one of racism. The planet Lattice is invaded by the salamander Bacterian planetoid, and Lattice cannot fight them off alone. They need help from their rival planet in the system, Gradius. Gradius, having fought off the Bacterian once before already, send 3 pilots in their Vic Viper ships to aid Lattice, and we come to find one of the 3 is descended from the old royal family of Lattice, who are now branded as traitors and have been struck entirely from the planet's history. The pilot is named Eddie Evans, and he is shown to be a mostly disconnected person, not fully understanding the context of his own life, as it were. Back when his family were ostracized from Lattice, the people of Gradius decided to take his family in, yet they were never really fully considered one of the Gradians, and thus Eddie never felt at home on that planet despite growing up and spending his entire life there. His father was just a boy when the family was expelled from Lattice. And again, upon returning to Lattice to help in their hour of need, all 3 Gradian pilots are themselves met with much stubbornness, skepticism, and even outright disregard from the Latians. Issues that are at the core of racist attitudes, and these issues lead to much death and destruction of much of the Latian military. Despite all this, it's Eddie who ultimately sacrifices himself in the final battle in the core of the planet Salamander, flying his Vic Viper directly into the gullet of a large dragon, which is impervious to damage from exterior fire. He tells Lord British, who also pilots a ship in this battle alongside the 3 Gradians, that he's not sacrificing himself for anything or anyone but himself, and he asks the prince to remember his actions before he gives his life. And indeed, later on in the OVA, Lord British does soften his attitude quite pointedly toward the Gradians, and he becomes much more accepting and understanding of others in general to the benefit of his entire planet, as it were. And racism is also at the core of Gradius and its story's antagonists. The genesis of Gradius comes in the form of the first invasion by the Bacterian, named the Northern Cross War. At the time, the planet Gradius was home to 2 races, the humans and the Reek. The Reek were psychically sensitive people, and thus could not bear living on the planet's northern hemisphere due to the increased level of solar radiation, and so the planet was segregated by racial boundaries along a geographical area for much of its history. And then the Northern Cross War came, and it nearly wiped out the entirety of the Reek due to the invasion making its way the furthest on the planet's southern hemisphere. In fact, it's named the Northern Cross War because victory was won in the northern hemisphere's skies, as much of the southern half of the planet had been at that point already converted into large fields of organic matter. There were 2 relevant survivors of the Reek, James Burton and Dr. Venom. Yes, the same Venom from Gradius 5. The 2 immediately joined the Gradian defense efforts, with Dr. Venom himself designing the Vic Viper spatio-temporal fighter, which would prove to be the key development in the defense against the Bacterian. James Burton would go on to pilot the Vic Viper in defense of the planet, eventually being made a leader of the Gradian people. However, before that happened, during the constant recurring struggles against the Bacterian, Dr. Venom grew impatient with how the Gradian defense was being managed and attempted a coup d'etat, but was apprehended before carrying out the plot. Once the conflict with the Bacterian had ended, Venom remained a prisoner but eventually escaped, fleeing and turning against the Gradians by joining the Bacterian and willingly becoming the subject for their next cyber brain. This resulted in the beginning of successive invasions by the Bacterian, many of which were overseen by Dr. Venom. For about 200 years, Dr. Venom attempted invasion after invasion and failed, and eventually James Burton, who at one point had risen to the leader of the Gradian peoples, had died of old age. As Burton himself was the target of Venom's strongest anger, he hatched a plan to go back in time to when James was still a young child, invade Gradius, and kill him that way. Ironically, this event turns out to be the Northern Cross War, and Venom subsequently causes the very genocide that wiped out most of his own race and propelled James Burton to eventually become the great leader that he was. So you see again, racism has reared its ugly head at the core of the struggle of Gradius. Venom could never get over his own prejudice held against the Gradians, and by hanging on to that anger in the form of turning it against James Burton, who he likely saw as a traitor to the Reek, he inevitably sealed his own fate. You can hear his reformed brain's last words in Gradius 5, speaking of how his hate for your kind is eternal. And again in the OVA, the Bacterians' method for forcing host cyberbrains to destroy their own kind is to somehow pass on the Bacterians' memories to the host, which includes their deep hatred for all forms of life, not them. Now, if you'll excuse my indulgence, for the last part of this whole discussion, I want to kind of jump around to bring up the multiverse angle yet again. I mentioned earlier that the game Odomedius by Konami later came out and added on to the Gradius universe by establishing the G organization and its efforts to fight the Bacterian throughout the multiverses and throughout time as well. And, well, the Moai and the Vic Viper ships are quite commonly seen throughout the Konami game universes, as the Moai especially became a kind of unofficial mascot for the company back in the 80s. To list all the games the Moai makes an appearance in would take a while, and could be its own video perhaps, but I'm not going to go into all that here. Instead, I want to focus on another fairly well-established franchise maker at Konami, Hideo Kojima, my favorite game maker. Kojima is relevant to the Gradius discussion simply because of Zone of the Enders, and because at the core of Zone of the Enders' plot is recurring, rampant racism between the people of Earth and Mars. Zone of the Enders 2 features a ship named the Vic Viper, a prototype capable of performing well beyond the expected parameters of other ships like it at the time, even able in this game to transform into an upright humanoid mech configuration to fight other orbital frame mechs that should outclass it but somehow struggle against the Viper. And further in Zone of the Enders 2, during a replay of the game, there is a secret that can be unlocked which lets you play the hidden minigame Gradius, a 3D recreation of the first level of Gradius in the Zone of the Enders engine. So is this all just a reference though? I'd say it's not, and in fact that somehow the Bacterian may have spread to the Zone of the Enders franchise, thus spurring the appearance of a Vic Viper to fight back against the threat. And Zone of the Enders isn't the only Kojima franchise to feature Gradius elements. If you've gone hunting for all the secrets in the Metal Gear Solid games, you would have found multiple Moai statues along the way. The most significant of these secrets is, in my opinion, the ones found in Metal Gear Solid V Ground Zeroes, the demo game version of the full Phantom Pain that released later. The Moai statues themselves are not necessarily indicative of Bacterian, as they could be the good Moai placed there as protectors, but I believe this is probably not the case, as in Ground Zeroes, there's another oddly placed side mission named Jamais Vu, where the player controls Raiden from Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance, who's a good 40 years of time travel away from his home, complete with his high-frequency blade. Raiden's there at Camp Omega to hunt yet another mimic beast from another Hideo Kojima franchise, Snatchers. In fact, the way Snatchers function is eerily similar to the Bacterian. Their MO is to kill and replace humans who they then use as cover to secretly enact whatever their collective plan may be. And it just so happens that all these different mimic references converge somehow in Metal Gear Solid's fictional version of Guantanamo Bay, perhaps the epicenter of the real-world US racist attitudes taken form in the dehumanizing, brutal conditions the prisoners there are kept in. If the meta-narrative at this point is not clear, I don't know how much clearer it can really make itself. And so, just to indulge a little bit further, I'll leave you with one more reference to ponder. In Kojima's latest game, Death Stranding, there's a room owned by a character, Higgs, who's obsessed with trying to uncover some kind of secret of the Death Stranding. Later on in this game, you can gain access to his room and see all the crazy stuff in there, among them being some Egyptian hieroglyphs written on the wall that translate to the proper name of King Tutankhamun, and also King Tut's golden burial death mask on a table in a corner. And back in Gradius, only in Life Force, the English translation and port of Salamander, which had additional levels added, there's a level that wasn't in Salamander featuring a reference to King Tut. The level is an unknown field in space that the Vic Viper jets off to after defeating the previous level's boss, flying over some rocky terrain at first before coming to the entrance of a clearly Egyptian temple where a statue of a character that has the head of Horus, the head ornament of Ra, the staff of Set, and the crook and scepter of Osiris sitting overseeing the entrance. The crook and scepter of Osiris can also be found in the hands on King Tut's sarcophagus, and the boss at the end of this level is a giant floating death mask of King Tut with 8 floating impervious golden balls flying around him. The weak point are his eyes when they light up, which actually you can also see in Stargate when someone's who's got a parasite go old and they use their powers, and okay, that's enough. You get the picture. Egyptians, erasing history, racism, multiverses, time travel, it's all very cool and heavy stuff, and you have to consider that developers of the Gradius games at least had some of these ideas even back in the 80s when these games were mostly just about the sprites and music and simply operating within the limitations they worked with back then. And to me, it's nice to know that developers like Hideo Kojima have continued to carry the same lessons and attitude of spreading a message of anti-hate through their art into the future. And so, next time you're playing some seemingly mindless game about just flying around and shooting stuff, consider that there might be more going on than meets the eye. This video is sponsored by the Ender's Gang.